From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking about the Biden administration's recently released national security strategy. The episode will be divided into 4 parts, with 4 different experts from across MEI weighing in with their thoughts on the NSS, their key takeaways, and what it means for U.S. policy toward the Middle East. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. You can follow all of MEI's coverage of U.S. foreign and security policy on our website at www.mei.edu. First up on the program, I'll be speaking with Ross Harrison. Ross is a senior fellow and director of research at the Middle East Institute. He's also on the faculty of the Political Science Department at the University of Pittsburgh. Ross, welcome back to the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair. It's an honor to be with you today.
Ross, to start off, for our listeners who might not follow foreign policy matters quite as closely as you do, can you briefly explain what the national security strategy is and why it matters?
Of course. I think the way to look at this document, Alistair, is that it's less of a strategy and more a delineation of how this administration identifies the goals and interests of the United States at this point in time. It also identifies the threats to those interests and the capabilities that will be required in order to confront those threats and advance those interests. So it's less of a strategy and more of an articulation of goals, interests, threats, and capabilities. But I don't think we should be critical of the document because it doesn't lay out an explicit strategy. First of all, remember, this is an unclassified document. It's probably among all the documents, all the plan documents or strategy documents that the U.S. administration, any U.S. administration will put out, it's the most public. It's rolled out publicly, even though it's designed, usually written by the National Security Advisor, in this case, Jake Sullivan. It's signed off by the President of the United States. So it's a high-profile document. And because it's unclassified, we shouldn't expect it to identify specifically what strategy the administration intends to pursue relative to advancing our interests, lest it signal to our adversaries and even to our allies things that we just don't want them to know. For example, the timing, the sequencing, and the timing of the rollout of particular activity. So I think we should just understand that we should not expect this to be an explicit strategy document. That having been said, you asked the question of why it matters. It matters because it is publicly rolled out. It's designed to articulate to the American people what our priorities are. It's designed to articulate to other parts of the administration, the U.S. administration, what the priorities are, what capabilities are going to be required, what kind of expenditures will be required. And frankly, it's also designed with our adversaries and our allies as target audiences here, to signal to them what's important to the United States and what they can expect, or at least what we want them to expect from us going forward. I think the other reason it's important is that it lives within an ecosystem of other plans and documents. This is not the only strategy document out there. There's the National Defense Strategy, I believe used to be called the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, which is a classified document. I think there's a public version of it as well, but it's presented to the Congress. That, I'm sure, goes into much greater depth and has more granularity in terms of the specifics of how we identify that strategy. There's also, or at least there used to be, something called the QDDR, the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, put out by the State Department. So this document kind of lays out the broad outlines of how this administration sees the threats that are out there today and what threats might emerge over the next couple of years. And then oftentimes it's used as a springboard for developing other plans. So it is an important document and should not be looked at just as a freestanding document.
Ross, following up on that, having reviewed the new NSS, what were your key takeaways? What was kind of more or less as expected, and what jumped out at you?
Yeah, I mean, notwithstanding my comment that this is not an explicit strategy document, I would say that it's probably the least anodyne, the least ambiguous document, national security strategy I've seen. And I've looked at each one probably over the last 10 to 15 years. What struck me is that at least there's the outline of the administration's strategic thinking, even though it's not explicated in granular terms. If you're looking for it, you will find the broad outlines or the rough outlines of the strategy, and that's usually not the case in these documents. They tend to be very much focused only on capabilities and goals and interests, and that's pretty much it. But there is the outline of a strategy here, and that did strike me. Maybe it would be good for me to sort of give my sense of what we mean by a strategy here, and that is that a strategy is really a theory. It's a theory of how, if the U.S. does X, either the environment or a particular opponent in that environment will achieve Y, or the opponent will be affected by Y. It's also a way in which you make what would be otherwise improbable at least possible. And I think we see that in the document, and we see it certainly live on our TV screens every day with the Ukraine crisis, that if you ask somebody January of this year, before Russia, launched their onslaught onto the Ukraine, whether in fact Russia could be denied a quick victory, you would probably say, without the U.S. involvement, without NATO involvement, probably that would be not impossible, but improbable. And what we've seen is through the application of resources and capabilities and strategies, we've seen that what was improbable at least now seems possible. So I think the fact that there's at least the outline of a strategy here in this document is striking to me. The second thing that's striking is it's really a counter strategy or defensive strategy, not an offensive strategy. I think the way in which this document lays out the threats to American interests, largely from China, but mostly China in the long term and Russia in the immediate term, is that they believe that Russia poses a threat to two key elements of what has existed in the global order since the end of World War II. And that is the liberal international order itself. And secondly, the preservation of democracy, frankly. I think the administration understands that Vladimir Putin has a strategy for undermining those two things, both the global international order and the proliferation of democracies. And he's done that, I think, pretty artfully up until the Ukraine crisis, over the last 10 to 15 years. The Biden administration fully understands that when Russia went into Georgia in 2008, it sent a message to governments in the region, in his immediate neighborhood. It also created some friction and some divisions within NATO. And then he goes into Syria in 2015 and changes the political environment in the Middle East. So there's an understanding, I think, that Vladimir Putin had a strategy. And I think what this administration has articulated is that fighting or fending off Russia in Ukraine is not just about the human rights for Ukrainian citizens, though that's important. It's not just about denying Russia a victory in its neighborhood. It's about preserving the global international liberal order that has been in place since the end of World War II, and frankly, maintain the integrity of democracies in Europe and the United States. So denying Russia a victory in Ukraine and the way in which we are using our alliances, which is something that's in this front and center of this document, the way in which we maintain our alliances, build our alliances, strengthen our alliances, marshal those alliances towards fending off Russia's onslaught into the Ukraine, is the strategy for, I believe, and this administration believes this anyway, for maintaining the liberal international order at home and preserving, or liberal international order and preserving democracy in Europe and home. And if you think about it, if we're able to, if the U.S. is able to, U.S. and NATO partners and the grit of the Ukrainian people are able to deny Russia a victory, I think it does strengthen NATO and therefore the liberal international order. And it also sends a message to would-be autocrats in Europe that the Putin model might not be the best model going forward. And it could actually have a salutary, healthy effect on democracy in Western Europe. And I think have a salutary effect on democracy at home. One thing that is striking, Alistair, about this document is the link that is made between U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy. Now, we've always, in any document, you always see that strength at home leads to strength abroad. But what's striking is the articulation that strength in our foreign policy is required in order to be able to preserve our democracy at home. The fact that a successful foreign policy at this moment in time can actually strengthen our democracy at home is something that's quite striking. Anyway, those are the two areas that strike me the most about this document.
No, that latter point is an excellent one that really jumped out at me when I was looking through it as well. I know you're working on a book on Iran at the moment, so I have to ask about that specifically. Were there any surprises there on that front, especially given the kind of current situation on the ground in Iran?
I would say yes. I mean, the document almost is written as if the JCPOA had collapsed. There was very little mention about actually working to rejoin the JCPOA on the U.S. side or bring Iran back into compliance. So it talks a lot about the need to push back against Iran's regional activities, and at least makes a bow to the current unrest in the country, but very little on the JCPOA. A lot on nuclear proliferation or non-proliferation, but it almost kind of positions the administration for a collapse of the JCPOA, which has not been announced either by the Iranians or the Americans. But it kind of doesn't hold out much hope that there's going to be a deal.
Ross, how does the administration's current policy stack up against what they've laid out here in the national security strategy when it comes to the Middle East specifically? And what do you see as the biggest challenges when it comes to actually implementing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one answer would be just what I gave you before, which is that, right, the official policy is that we're still pursuing pursuing negotiations with the Iranians and our JCPOA partners on returning to the nuclear deal. And this document does not really say much about that. So it kind of assumes almost or positions the United States for the inability to rejoin the deal and for a post-JCPOA environment. That's number one. Number two, I think it kind of reinstates, in a way, the Carter Doctrine, which is it mentions there that we are going to preserve the integrity of the flow of energy, hydrocarbons and oil and gas through the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, that we're going to protect that. That's important for the United States. And that kind of really doesn't square with kind of what we're doing right now in terms of reevaluating our policy towards Saudi Arabia. So it's not clear how that statement kind of aligns with what we're seeing on the ground right now. So that sort of struck at me. And there's very little mentioned about our relationship, very contentious relationship, difficult relationship with Turkey. There's a bow to Israel. There's very little about Egypt, Jordan, and as I mentioned, Turkey. What's striking to me about this is that when we talk about our allies, we're talking about our European allies and our Asian allies, East Asian allies. There's very little in the document to talk about strengthening our other than with Israel, strengthening our relationship with regional allies. And that is a bit striking to me, given that we have been trying to, particularly in the midst of the Ukraine crisis, strengthen our relationship with some of our allies in the region, and those efforts seem to be failing. So there seems to be a misalignment there. But generally, those are the main areas that I think are where and in terms of the biggest challenges, remember, this is not a plan. So I don't think implementation, this is a hard document to implement from. I think what's important is that in terms of implementation, that we, particularly during the winter months that are facing us now, what's going to be important will be that we are able to maintain, strengthen, and keep our allies with us on pushing back against Russia's efforts in Ukraine. Those are the plans, I think, that are the most difficult, or are going to be challenged the most, and will require the most meticulous planning, because it's quite there's going to be a lot of stress on the alliance system as Europe goes cold this winter.
Ross, before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I think my only thought is what I really started with, which is this is probably one of the more robust documents, national security strategies I've seen, and I think the reason for that is the nature of the threats. There's an immediate threat from Russia, both in Ukraine, both in Europe, the liberal international order, and frankly at home. And so I think the reason that it's a bit more robust is the searing nature of the threat, and that should alarm us all and give us a sense of opportunity, but also a sense of caution.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but Ross, thank you very much for joining the program.
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you to all our listeners.
Next up on today's episode, we're joined by Jerry Feierstein, Distinguished Senior Fellow on U.S. Diplomacy and Director of MEI's Arabian Peninsula Affairs Program. Jerry, welcome back, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Alistair. And as always, I'm delighted to be able to join this podcast.
It's a pleasure to have you. Let's dive right in. The national security strategy has been criticized for its timing, that it was released too late, more than a year and a half into the new administration. What exactly does the process of putting it together entail? And do you think that's a fair criticism?
Well, I think that you should understand that that these national security strategies really are not meant as roadmaps as much as they are meant to basically confirm and codify decisions that have already been made. And of course, the drafting goes through a number of iterations. There are many agencies of the U.S. government that have a role to play in creating the document, in formulating the policies, and in finally putting it together into some kind of a final format. And so, beginning from a dead start at the beginning of an administration, it's reasonable that it takes a long period of time. And again, I think that people shouldn't be looking at this as something that is mapping the way forward as much as it is as a document that cements in place decisions that have already been made.
Having gone through the national security strategy, what are your key takeaways? What do you think it does well, and where do you think it misses the mark?
Well, I think again, it's a pretty fair description of the approach that the Biden administration is taking to these core issues in foreign policy. There are really no surprises here. The identification of the competition with China and Russia, that really goes back at least through the beginning of the Trump administration, back into the Obama administration. The emphasis that the document places on support for democracies and for democratic governance around the world is something that we've heard from the Biden administration since its very earliest days. And certainly what we've seen over these past 18 months are efforts by the administration to put it together. And the thing that struck me is that if you compare what's in the document to the president's trip to the Middle East in the summer, his stop in Jeddah in July, many of the elements that were emphasized in his meetings with GCC leaders and the others from Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, that really stressed cooperation and coordination on some of the big issues that are likely to face the world over these coming years and decades, on climate, on public health, on environmental challenges, rising water levels, food insecurity. Those are the things that the president's been talking about, and those are all inscribed and included in this document.
Jerry, well, it's clear the administration's focus is elsewhere, largely on geopolitical competition with China and Russia, as you mentioned. Do you think it gave the Middle East short shrift?
No, I don't think so. I think, again, it puts in place the trends and the directions that this administration, and in fact, that the U.S. has been pursuing for a number of years now. I think that the emphasis on reducing the role of military initiatives in the region and the desire to transition to more diplomatic processes, political engagement, the reduction of tensions in the region. These are all things that have been ongoing. I know that some of our friends in the region find it a little uncomfortable that they see the U.S. security umbrella declining a little bit over time. But again, this is something that the administration has talked about from the very early days, which is the desire to end the over reliance on military and security initiatives and really begin to transition to diplomatic efforts to reduce tension, to end some of the conflicts. These are all things that the administration has talked about. And frankly speaking, I think that these are things that probably the American people are ready to see as well.
Jerry, how do you think this strategy stacks up or compares to those that were released under the Obama and Trump administrations?
Well, again, I think that what you have here is more an emphasis on continuity. That really it began with the Obama administration, what was referred to in those days as the pivot to Asia, the recognition that we were going to move away from the global war on terrorism that had been initiated after 2001, that the Obama administration wanted to look more forward towards what we saw as the main challenges to the U.S. in the coming years, particularly from China. That covers the whole range of issues, particularly on the economy, but also military security and political affairs. And so we saw the same thing with the Trump administration, even though when Donald Trump came into office, he emphasized, made his very first visit overseas to Saudi Arabia. There was a great deal of expectation in the region that he was going to restore the centrality of the Middle East to U.S. foreign policy. That didn't happen. And I think that this document, like its predecessor documents, reflects and mirrors the reality that the U.S. sees itself engaged in this great power competition.
Jerry, President Biden has put a great deal of emphasis on the competition between democracies and autocracies. One of the biggest challenges for the US when it comes to the Middle East is the seeming discrepancy between what the strategy refers to as, quote, the democratic values at the heart of the American way of life and the autocratic nature of many US partners in the region. The document tries to kind of square that circle by saying that, quote, the most pressing strategic challenge is not necessarily from authoritarian powers as such, but from those that, and it's a slightly creative turn of phrase here, layer authoritarian governance with a revisionist foreign policy. I kind of wanted to get your read on that. Do you think it's a difficult point to kind of get right, but what was your kind of take on that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Alistair, and it's a way of trying to distinguish between countries with an authoritarian bent that are friends of ours and countries with an authoritarian bent that are not friends of ours. And so it was a difficult circle to square. But I think that there is some realistic sense of that definition. That in fact we do recognize, and we have always had relations with countries that were less democratically disposed than the U.S. or our Western allies. It's a reflection of the world. I also noticed that in one section it refers to the ITUT relationships, which is the U.S. with India, Israel, and the UAE, and it refers to them as democratic states. Well, one could argue that at least three, if not all four of those states have democratic challenges. And it's not entirely clear that any of them would pass muster in the Biden definition of what a democratic state is. So, I think that there's always going to be a little bit of flexibility in how you define and how you recognize that we do need to do business with countries that pursue policies domestically that are not entirely consistent with our desires. I remember back in the Reagan administration, Gene Kirkpatrick trying to explain the difference between authoritarian and totalitarian societies, and explaining that while totalitarian societies were all bad, the authoritarians were quite okay in our books.
Before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Well, I think it's a useful document. Again, I don't think that anyone who's reading it will see very much new or unexpected in this document. I think that it is a fair representation of where the Biden administration has been over this past 18 months and where it wants to go going forward. And again, I think that readers will see that there is a great deal of consistency between where the Biden administration is and where its predecessors were. So again, I think, despite the differences in party, despite some of the rhetorical flourishes that we might see from one administration to the next, the reality is that there's a certain consistency in U.S. foreign policy, and this document reflects that.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but thank you very much for joining the program, Jerry.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Alistair.
Next up on the program, we're joined by Dr. Marwa Maziad. Marwa is a non-resident scholar with MEI's Defense and Security Program and a visiting assistant professor of Israel Studies at the Gildenhorn Institute at the University of Maryland. Marwa, welcome to the program, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dive right in. What are your key takeaways from the new national security strategy? What jumped out at you or surprised you the most when it comes to the Middle East?
I think the key takeaways is in this title, the idea that we're supporting de-escalation and integration. So there is a sense that maybe diplomacy is going to play a bigger role in that outlook to the Middle East and their sense of integration. And in fact, the strategy emphasizes that for decades we've been looking to the region as if it's the place where threats are emanating, and we've used military centric policies to address that and even regime change, and that somehow we ignored unintended consequences. And for that reason, the strategy is very clear about the non use of our military to change regimes or remake societies, but instead limit the use of force to circumstances that are really strictly protecting our national security interests. So I think the outlook itself towards the Middle East is a bit different from what we were used to for decades. And that's the biggest takeaway, is that there will be, therefore, principles that will be applied in looking at the region, not as a source of military action and threats, but maybe a more peaceful and stable region. So that's what jumped up out to me.
Following up on that, what were the most obvious gaps or glaring omissions as you see it? What wasn't in there but should have been?
So this veering away from any or omission of the pan-Islamist terrorism, or the sense that there is expansionist ideological direction from countries from within the region like Turkey or Iran, there isn't that much emphasis on that, as if there is a recognition that we're beyond that threat somehow, that we are there is room for more integration within the region, and that the divides among the region players have been crossed enough, and that we're acting according to that. So I think it's interesting that there isn't that much emphasis on terrorism coming from the region anymore, all while of course recognizing that Iran needs to be countered and stopped, and no nuclear weapon to be acquired, etc. But this idea, this notion that the region is festering with terrorism, is not in the picture that is drawn here. So I wonder if that's a good thing, as in maybe we've made some progress on that, or is that an actual omission and it will come back to haunt us, that there is still this terrorism in the region that we're not addressing adequately.
Remember, one of the main criticisms of the Biden administration's foreign policy, like that of many of its predecessors, has been that it lacks a real Middle East policy. To what extent do you think that this lays one out?
I think it actually does lay out a policy. It's based on what they call a new framework with 5 principles. And the principles are clear. First, that we will support and strengthen partnerships with the countries that subscribing to rule-based international order, while allowing them to defend themselves against foreign threats. So here we also need to recognize how each country has to define its own foreign threats. If some countries looked at, as I say, pan-Islamism as a foreign threat because it was supported by regional players, then we have to recognize and respect that, for instance. A second principle is the idea that we will not allow any power to jeopardize freedom of navigation. So this is an emphasis here on the protection of waterways. Third is that we're going to use diplomacy to do that. So it's very clear that, we're not doing these regime change wars, and we're not very aggressive about that. Diplomacy is key. A fourth principle here is that we will work on the integration of our partners in terms of security, defense, integrated air and maritime defense structures, while leaving them the liberty and respecting their sovereignty and independent choice. So this is very important because our partners sometimes, when we talk about a NATO-like regional integration systems, etc., I always hear from countries like Egypt, for instance, or even Israel, for that matter, is that it's very important for them to have the freedom of choice to act on their own perceptions of threats, etc. So while it's important that we recognize that. And fifth, the idea that we will continue to promote human rights, but also with the recognition that things have to emanate from within societies, and we're not going to impose our values per se in a very militaristic way. So now I think this is actually laying out a policy. It has a framework that is recognizing also that the region has crossed maybe some and bridged some divides, and I would say that this is a clear policy.
Well, it's clear from the strategy that the administration's main focus is elsewhere, principally on geopolitical competition with China and Russia. And the document even notes that when it comes to the Middle East, that, quote, it's time to eschew grand designs in favor of more practical steps that can advance U.S. interests and help regional partners. Given the scale of the challenges facing the U.S. in other arenas like the Indo-Pacific and in Europe with the war in Ukraine, do you think this gets the balance right, or is it perhaps too modest when it comes to the Middle East?
I don't think it's too modest. I think it's recognizing that maybe the region again is bridging some of its divides. It's true. Maybe the past decades were way more conflict driven and violent than the outlook for the future. But I think it's very important to recognize that Russia and China, our main focus and competition, are present in the region, and therefore it's very important to realize that our partners in the region will have their independent decision making vis-a-vis those competitors, and deliberating on how with them on how to address that is very important. We cannot be forceful in the way we pressure countries against their own national interests, for example. So it's very important to speak from national interests, our own national interests in the United States, but recognize when another country uses the same vocabulary, like Saudi Arabia, when it uses the same vocabulary about national interests, it's almost speaking in the language we understand. So yes, our position to think about Russia and China is, of course, important, but we need to recognize that Russia and China are in the region, and they are working and weaving their own relations with our partners.
Marwa, I don't know that anyone's going to argue with some of the aims spelled out here, like a more integrated Middle East that empowers our allies and partners while reducing the resource demands the region makes on the United States. But given the current context, how realistic and manageable does that seem in your view?
I think it's somewhat realistic in the sense that we are delegating a little bit more to our regional partners to sort out things among themselves. I think Israel's integration over the past couple of years is a plus. So it's not like we're leaving the region or we are not there, but we are relying more on our partners to sort things out regarding the region, and having recognized that they bridge some of their divides is very important. So it's not necessarily too naive or unrealistic. However, when they speak to us about their perceived threats, we have to be very attentive. So if Iran is a perceived threat and it's an actual threat to Israel and Saudi Arabia and UAE and other partners in the Gulf, we have to pay attention to that. If Turkey and Qatar were a threat with their pan-Islamism over the Muslim Brotherhood, was a threat to our partner Egypt for a good while, we have to attend to that as well. So I think it's only going to be realistic when we listen and understand fully the actual perceived external foreign threats to our partners. So we cannot just tell them, you de-escalate your conflicts and integrate and work on stabilizing the region without really fully understanding their own threat perceptions. So it will only be realistic as far as we allow them some freedom to define their threats and work among themselves to combat some of these threats and help in the direction towards that outcome.
Marwa, before we conclude, any final thoughts?
Well, I think just to reiterate, it's all in the title, the idea that we're looking at the region as a place of de-escalation, conflicts have been bridged, and that there is a need for integration. So if that's the outlook for the next decade or so, then that's great. It just depends on how much we're going to fully grasp the threat perception of our partners there.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but Marwa, thank you very much for joining the program.
Thank you.
Next up on the podcast, I'll be speaking to Melissa Horvath. Melissa is a non-resident scholar with MEI's Defense and Security Program and the lead foreign military sales instructor and curriculum developer at ASRC Federal, where she supports the Army's Security Cooperation Workforce Education Program. She has over 25 years of planning, logistics, training, and security cooperation experience with the U.S. military. Melissa, welcome to the program, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dive right in. Melissa, what are your key takeaways from the new national security strategy? What do you think it does well, and where does it come up short?
Sure. So I found a lot of key takeaways. None were all too surprising or a departure from the 2021 interim guidance, or even really the key priorities outlined in the 2017 strategy. They put a little more emphasis naming China as the pacing challenge, and of course, Russia as an immediate threat to security, given the current events in the world. The 2022 strategy also called out climate change as the greatest shared problem and potentially existential for all nations. Another key takeaway I saw was the emphasis on partnerships and alliances being critical to executing the strategy. The 48-page document mentions partners a whopping 67 times. So definitely an emphasis there. I think what the strategy did well is provide a clear national defense priorities and goals, as well as defense capabilities required to deter threats and address security concerns. While national security strategies in general are often criticized for being very broad, very aspirational, very high level, I think it's about right. The purpose is to provide that high level strategic guidance and vision and inform the responsible departments in their planning efforts. So at lower levels, that's where we'll see greater specificity, the linking of ends, ways, and means in strategies like the National Defense Strategy and National Military Strategy, and then all the way down to combatant commanders' campaign plans. The NSS gives us overarching guidance, so those documents fill in those gaps in addressing both the magnitude of each challenge and assigning resources and priorities to those challenges. They'll provide the ways and means to achieve the ends. Given that the NSS is strategic level guidance, I think it does well in laying out defense priorities, goals, and end states. One of the areas where I think it comes up short was really in the time it took to release it, almost 2 years into the current administration. We've seen DoD release a national defense strategy earlier this year, which ideally would happen after the NSS to ensure that they're linked and nested and that national defense strategy incorporates the guidance, goals, and vision of the NSS. I think the NSS also comes up short in its discussion of integrated deterrence. It particularly lacks a discussion on will. So in other words, how we let adversaries know we'll follow through. It says that our adversaries must understand that we can respond and have the capability to respond, but fall short in discussing how we communicate the message that we have the will to respond. One other specific area where the NSS comes up short and even contradictory is in heavily relying on cooperation with many non-democratic global partners as a linchpin of U.S. strategy. While the NSS highlights the strength of democracies and emphasizes human rights, it also concedes that we will work with many non-democracies and like-minded states, but it doesn't say to what extent or at what point we might choose not to. And I think we're seeing some of that tension play out in our relationships with our Middle East partners.
Absolutely. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And I did think it was interesting how they kind of tried to square that circle with terms of phrase like states that layer authoritarian government with revisionist foreign policy was the phrase that jumped out of me in that particular regard. But looking at the big picture and all the challenges facing the U.S. around the world, from the war in Ukraine to obviously the great power competition with China and the Indo-Pacific, do you think this gives the Middle East the right amount of focus and emphasis?
Given the global strategic challenges facing the US today, I think it does. The strategy correctly identifies the People's Republic of China as the military's pacing challenge, and of course, Russia as an immediate threat. It doesn't wholly ignore the Middle East. The region gets some emphasis in a page and a half close to the end of the document that opens by pointing out how over 2 decades of foreign policy focus on threats emanating from the region and military-centric policies led to unsustainable outcomes and unintended consequences. So military engagement and posture in the region is definitely de-emphasized. Instead, it emphasizes the need to advance U.S. interests in the region and the goals of stability and prosperity, but with those military assets needed elsewhere to address bigger and more urgent threats. The approach it describes is one that forgoes a large military presence in the U.S. CENTCOM AOR and in the Middle East. And that's an area that just 2 years ago had over 80,000 U.S. troops and currently has 35,000. So U.S. Central Command becomes the bill payer in terms of military force posture. And because the NSS calls for a strong and consistent defense presence in the Indo-PACOM region, a need to step up our own sizable contributions to NATO, and the requirement to modernize and strengthen our military, it gives us that clear prioritization that doesn't include major operations or force posture in the Middle East. Instead, it lays out a framework that includes de-escalation through diplomacy and integration through partnerships.
Melissa, as you noted earlier, the NSS highlights our alliances and partnerships around the world as, quote, our most important strategic asset and an indispensable element contributing to international peace and stability. But it's released at a time, as you mentioned, when U.S. ties with key partners in the region, especially Saudi Arabia, are strained. How do you think the U.S. can address that disconnect and strike the right balance moving forward?
That's definitely an area where we need to strike the right balance. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen the release of the NSS, and that calls for, as you said, alliances and partnerships as strategic assets and indispensable. At nearly the same time, the president announced he was going to reevaluate the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia over the OPEC plus oil production cuts. We saw several members of Congress calling for a freeze in arms sales and security cooperation to Saudi Arabia, and public suggestions that the country's foreign military sales orders be diverted to other partners in the Indo-PACOM region. Last week, also, a senator blocked $75 million in foreign military financing to Egypt over human rights concerns and the situation facing political prisoners there. So there's definitely a tension. And we have a need to cooperate in the region where we no longer have a strong U.S. presence and where Russia and China are more than willing to fill any gaps or voids in cooperation and arms sales with their own resources. I think it'll be a tough balance to strike moving forward. I think as we look at cooperation in the region or the prospect of freezing cooperation, we need to consider second and third order effects of those decisions and then determine holistically what's in the best interest of the United States. If we pause foreign military sales or foreign military financing or other forms of security cooperation, and we choose to disengage from our partners in the region, we end up creating greater instability. And that benefits Iran, its proxies, and terrorist groups operating in the region. Additionally, countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt have already diversified their defense and security relationships. This would move them even closer to Russia and China. That diminishes U.S. influence in a region where there's 3 of the world's most critical maritime choke points, and there's opportunities to compete with China. More than 40% of Chinese oil imports pass through one of those straits. So on the one hand, we don't want to provide unconditional support for partners who don't share our common vision and common values. But on the other hand, we cannot cede our influence in such a strategically important region of the world. It's just not in our best interests, and it would diminish our own national security.
Melissa, you touched on it earlier, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail on the concept of integrated deterrence, which the NSS highlights as central to our defense strategy. Based on what's laid out here, do you have a sense of what that will look like and how it will operate in the Middle East?
Yes, I think we're already seeing what it will look like, especially in the Middle East, where continued military force reductions are driving the need for other ways to address threats, other ways to project military strength, and other ways to deter our adversaries. Some of this has been happening through de-escalation, attempting to lessen the threat through diplomacy, renegotiating the JCPOA with Iran. And because that's not been working very well or as well as we'd like it, finding other ways to deter threats. The key to deterrence, though, is convincing adversaries that the costs of their aggression outweigh the benefits. And without robust U.S. force presence, like we've seen over the past few decades, we rely on our network of allies and partners to project the strength and impose that cost. So to be effective, the U.S. needs to rely on our partners, but also signal a will to impose costs. The 2022 National Defense Strategy that DoD transmitted to Congress back in March introduced this concept of integrated deterrence as a ways to advance the department's goals. While that entire strategy is classified, the unclassified fact sheet described using other instruments of national power, and again, leveraging that partnership, that network of our regional partners. And that's exactly what we've been seeing from DoD. The new NSS doubles down on this, dedicating an entire page to the concept of integrated deterrence and mentioning our partnerships as a way to get after that. What we're specifically seeing in U.S. Central Command is continuing work with Middle East partners on integrated air and missile defense and maritime security initiatives. Both of those are specifically called out in the NSS. We've also recently seen new cooperative projects like the Red Sands Missile Integrated Experimentation Center. Integration and building cooperation and coalitions is not going away. It's the key to moving forward in developing and projecting strength, credibility, military capability and capacity, and the ability to respond to threats from Iran, its proxies, and terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And despite some recent challenges in the political side to our relationship with our Middle East partners, I think the military relationships remain strong and enduring, and we will need to continue those relationships to build that deterrence in a region where the threats aren't going away anytime soon.
Melissa, before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
While aspirational, I think the national security strategy does lay out a solid vision for U.S. interests, objectives, and policies. It outlines how the U.S. will move forward to strengthen its military capabilities, build those strong defense and deterrence relationships, and address our priority threats. It's not without some challenges or contradictions, and subsequent departmental and command strategies will need to tie the high-level goals in the NSS to resources and funding. In areas like the Middle East, where there's not as many military resources to go around as there were in years past, we'll need to integrate with partners and allies and rely on diplomacy and de-escalation to achieve those national security objectives.
We'll have to leave things there, but Melissa, thank you very much for joining the program, and we hope to have you back soon.
Great. Thank you very much.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to all four of our guests on the program, as well as our listeners for tuning in, and to our podcast editor, Hans Fay, for all of his work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.